It has a longer history than people realize. Clara Zetkin in Germany was supportive of the feminist view. She was a communist in Germany. Then she went to Russia. Alexandra Kollontai was a very well-known feminist in the USSR. She abandoned her 4 children to promote feminism politically. And in North America, Betty Friedan wrote a very important book. It was called The Feminine Mystique. But a more important book is her friend Daniel Horowitz's book entitled Betty Friedan and the Making of the Feminine Mystique. While everyone was thinking that poor Betty Friedan was a dissatisfied, unhappy housewife who had to leave the home and find a job and had so much trouble finding equality, she was in fact a long-time activist. So she had a long history of communism, which views the world in terms of class struggle. And when they look at the family, they interpret the class struggle to be male oppressor and female victim. So we can understand that Betty Friedan would always have to be a victim, even though she lived a very comfortable life. Her husband was very well employed. She had 3 children. She lived in beautiful suburbs. She had everything she needed, but she still portrayed herself as a victim. Another area of feminism which is very interesting, and it touches Canada, the famous 5, which has statues on Parliament Hill, were of the first wave of feminism. And Nellie McClung, she actually stated that the family should come first, and that if women have children, even if they're adult children, they should come first. So the early feminists were trying to get women out of the factories with their children so that they could be at home raising their families, and the father could have a family wage to free the mother, which is what women want, and which is what women wanted then. So when we succeeded as a Western culture after the Industrial Revolution to attain this for women and fathers and children, then along comes Betty Friedan and her ideas and all her cohorts saying that women were unhappy at home. And she actually referred to the very pleasant environment of the home in the 1960s as a comfortable concentration camp. Now that should have been a clue to people. How can you possibly compare the home to a concentration camp? Does she really know what a concentration camp is? So this is the mind that tried to influence North America along feminist lines, and that's the history of feminism. In Canada, there was the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, which obviously assumed that women weren't equal in the 60s. So they decided women had to be equal, and their view of equality was the mother working. And there were many recommendations, and one of the recommendations was to fund status of women. So when a government, often unfortunately the Liberal government, which I don't think was representative of all the members of the Liberal Party at the time, the Liberal government establishes an institution and funds it, well, basically that's the government deciding how Canadians should think and how women should think. So the status of women thought that they could represent all women, which they don't, but they have continued over the years with increasing government funding to project their view of the male oppressor and the female oppressed onto society. So they're basically telling us women are victims, men are exploiting the victims, and the government is going to do something about it by making sure women all work, they're not dependent, and their children are raised in substitute care in universal daycare. So that's basically the history as we see it. And any opposing view is shut down. We were able to function through the democratic system, make presentations before parliamentary committees. So our views and the views of the majority of women who think like us are on record. Well, if young boys have teachers who see themselves as feminist, They portray history as men being oppressive and women being the victims. Whereas the reality is that men have died to support our freer system of government. Men submit to motherhood when they support their family, when they are able to earn enough money so that the mother can stay at home and care for her own children. So they're submitting to motherhood, and that's never brought out. We are supportive of the education of women. Western civilization has always been supportive of education of women for centuries, if you really study the history of our civilization. But to give women preference because of supposed previous discrimination, we believe is unfair. So there needs to be an adjustment. Rather than the 50-50, we should adjust it in terms of what women really want. For example, the British Cabinet Office Women's Unit studied what women wanted in terms of employment and work at home, and they found that 20% of women want to focus on employment. 20% want to focus on motherhood, the home exclusively, and the 60% in between will adjust depending on whether they have children or not. Now, the 20% of women who want employment specifically usually don't intend to have children. So to bring that 20% and force a 50% is a distortion of democracy, what people want. And this is what feminists have accomplished, supposedly. So we propose advancement and acceptance in university strictly on merit rather than gender or any other identity that our social manipulators decide to impose. Well, it is definitely trying to deconstruct the family, and along with other philosophies have been very successful. If we look at the numbers of marriages, which are decreasing, and basically that's the fundamental stability of a nation, of a society, of a civilization. It's always been recognized that way. And even the newer sciences, psychology and psychiatry, recognize how important the family unit is. And economists recognize how important the family unit is. So when you deconstruct the basic family unit of society, you're really harming society. Now, when the feminists view the family as inherently destructive, where the male is oppressing the female, they view the family not as functioning in complementarity for the betterment of men, women, and children, but they see it as conflicting, as they see all of society, where they divide people in oppressor and oppressed. So if you have a really simplistic model that you're going to impose on society and you're going to impose it on the family, it's natural for them to view it that way. And why would you want that unit to continue functioning? And this has been viewed quite clearly in the opening up of divorce, which splits the family, and also which has been recognized time and time again as being very unfair, especially to men. And we have supported, in cases of divorce, equal shared parenting. Most of the lawyers and lawyers' associations are opposed to this, as well as the feminist organization or feminist-leaning organizations. The breakup of the family is very difficult on children, and there has been evidence that the involvement of the father is very important for the children. But very often, in divorce cases, the father is cut off from the family. Whereas with equal shared parenting, both parents would be viewed as equally important for the child. Now, this has been opposed for 20 years. It was recommended 20 years ago in Canada by the joint House of Commons Senate Committee on Custody and Access. They could see then, even shortly after divorce was legislated by the Trudeau government, from the very beginning it created problems. And efforts to improve the situation have been rejected by feminists and legal associations. Not all lawyers. Many lawyers have seen the damage and are in favor of equal shared parenting. So that's another area where that would definitely be deconstruction of the complementarity of men and women, the complementarity and the importance of fathers and mothers for the raising of the child. So we're really, in a sense, deconstructing the health of the child, and we're deconstructing what's best for men and women. The family has been shown statistically to be the best environment for men and women. The feminists forever are complaining about violence against women, and they complain about the gender wage gap, but there's a huge gap between marriage and common law couples. Married couples have a much lower incidence of violence. The incidence of violence in common law couples without marriage is 3 to 4 times what it is for marriage. So there's a huge gap between marriage and common law, which is consistently ignored by our government. And even Statistics Canada puts out the numbers, but they really don't emphasize this fact and in fact try to downplay it.
Subscribe and click the notification bell to receive updates about new content. Visit tomorrowsworld.org for more articles, telecasts and booklets.